In this tutorial, we'll be talking about risk. We'll differentiate between risk which is systematic versus risk which is unsystematic. The total risk of your asset is the combination of the systematic risk of that asset as well as the unsystematic risk of that asset. Now the question then becomes, what is systematic risk and what is unsystematic risk? Systematic risk is also known as market risk. It incorporates all factors that affect all participants in the market. So every company will be affected or has an element of systematic risk. Unsystematic risk is also known as firm or industry-specific risk, and it incorporates factors that only affect a particular firm or firms within a particular industry. Let's make use of an example in order to understand the differences between market risk versus firm-specific risk. Let's say that we're looking at a company called MTN. Now let's say that the government in the country that MTN operates in decides to increase the taxes. This will not only affect MTN, it will affect all companies that are operational in that country. And since it affects all companies, this risk is known as a market or systematic risk. But if the CEO of MTN decides to resign, or there's a labor strike by the employees of MTN, this will only affect MTN and therefore is an example of firm-specific risk. Now, if you've got a portfolio of assets and you're trying to reduce the risk of your portfolio, you can reduce it by diversification, and diversification will eliminate the unsystematic risk. But since all companies are affected by market forces, you cannot reduce the systematic risk. Now let's illustrate what we mean by this by use of a graph. This graph shows the relationship between the risk of a portfolio and the number of assets in that portfolio. Let's say you've got one asset again. Your entire portfolio is based on this one asset, let's call it MTN. So when the CEO of MTN resigns, and that's got an impact on MTN, because you only hold MTN in your portfolio, that will have a risk to your portfolio. But if you add another asset, let's say Coca-Cola, then the CEO of MTN resigning has got no impact on Coca-Cola. So the burden or the effect of the unsystematic risk is reduced on your portfolio as a whole. So you keep on adding more assets to your portfolio. So the more assets that you add to your portfolio, the less the weighting of firm-specific risk. So the more the assets that you add to your portfolio, the less the risk of that portfolio. But after a while, there's no more benefit to adding more assets to your portfolio, because whilst you might have enough assets to get rid of the firm or industry-specific risk, all assets are affected by the same market forces. They are affected by systematic risk. So you cannot eliminate that risk by adding more assets. So this graph shows two things. The first thing is that you can reduce the risk of your portfolio by diversifying and therefore eliminating the unsystematic risk. However, at some point, you can no longer eliminate risk because all assets are affected by systematic risk. So there's no further benefit in terms of reduced risk by diversifying your portfolio. So at a minimum, every portfolio consists of systematic risk.